Gray Montgomery stood by the wide, floor-to-ceiling window of his office, gazing out over the sprawling landscape of Johannesburg. The city skyline rose in the distance, shimmering under the afternoon sun. His wealth had bought him everything: status, respect, and power, but there were some things even his fortune couldn't control. His wife, Natasha, sat on a leather chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. She was silent, lost in her own thoughts, but the tension between them was palpable. It had been weeks of discussions, long nights spent weighing the options, and countless tears shed in private. Gray had finally reached a decision, one that he was certain would ensure the best future for their children, Grace and Sam. "We have to do this," Gray said, breaking the heavy silence that filled the room. His voice was firm, but underneath, there was a hint of uncertainty. Natasha's blue eyes met his, and for a moment, she said nothing. She knew Gray was right, but the thought of sending their children away tore at her heart. Grace was 14, with a quiet, introspective nature, while Sam, barely 12, was the more sensitive of the two, always seeking comfort in his sister's presence. The thought of them being miles away from home, at the mercy of strangers, filled her with dread. "Are we doing this for them or for us?" Natasha finally asked, her voice trembling. Gray sighed and turned away from the window. He walked over to his wife and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "It's for them, Natasha. We can't ignore the opportunities they'll have at Wellington boarding school. It's one of the best schools in the country. This is their chance to be surrounded by the elite, to secure their future." Natasha nodded slowly, though the unease in her chest remained. Wellington boarding school was prestigious, known for producing some of South Africa's finest leaders in business, law, and politics. Gray had attended the school himself, and he often credited it with shaping the man he had become. But that had been years ago. Times had changed. "We'll visit them every weekend, I promise," Gray added, sensing her reluctance. Natasha forced a smile, but she knew that once they left, their visits would be infrequent at best. The Montgomerys were among Johannesburg's elite, and their busy lives left little room for personal matters. Business came first, always. Later that evening, at the family dinner table, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Grace and Sam sat quietly, pushing food around their plates, already sensing that something was amiss. Gray and Natasha exchanged glances, each waiting for the other to break the news. Finally, Natasha cleared her throat and spoke softly, "Grace, Sam, your father and I have been discussing something very important." Both children looked up, their eyes wide with curiosity and concern. "You know how much we love you, and we want what's best for your future," Natasha continued. "We've decided to enroll you both at Wellington boarding school." Grace's fork clattered onto her plate. "Boarding school," she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. Sam, on the other hand, remained silent, his gaze shifting between his parents. He had always been the more introverted of the two, often relying on Grace to voice what he was feeling. "It's one of the best schools in South Africa," Gray added, his tone calm and measured. "You'll have access to top-quality education, extracurricular activities, and connections that will help you in the future." "But why can't we stay here?" Grace asked, her voice rising. "We are fine at St. Peter's. My friends are there, and we're doing well in school." Natasha's heart broke at the sight of her daughter's distress, but she maintained her composure. "We know this is sudden, Grace, but this is a chance for you and Sam to excel. You'll make new friends, and you'll have experiences that will prepare you for the real world." Sam finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go." Gray's expression hardened slightly. He had expected resistance, but he wasn't prepared to entertain it. "This is not up for debate, Sam. It's what's best for both of you." Sam's lower lip quivered, but he said nothing more. He had always been the one to avoid confrontation, unlike Grace, who was more outspoken. The rest of the dinner passed in silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. Grace and Sam finished their meals without another word, retreating to their rooms as soon as they were excused. Later that night, Grace knocked softly on Sam's door. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring out of the window, his shoulders slumped. "I don't want to go," Sam repeated, his voice hollow. Grace sat beside him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "Neither do I," she whispered. "But we don't have a choice. Dad's already made up his mind." Sam turned to look at her, his eyes filled with fear. "What if it's horrible there? What if they don't like us?" Grace smiled, trying to be strong for her brother's sake. "We'll have each other, okay? No matter what happens, we'll stick together." The next few days passed in a blur of packing, tearful goodbyes, and final moments spent in the comfort of their home. Natasha was particularly emotional, clinging to both children longer than necessary before finally letting them go. Gray remained stoic, though there were moments when his facade cracked, revealing the guilt he felt for sending them away. Wellington Boarding School was nestled in the quiet countryside, far from the noise and chaos of the city. As the Montgomery's car approached the towering gates, Grace and Sam felt a wave of unease wash over them. The school grounds were immaculate, with perfectly manicured lawns, grand buildings that resembled old English estates, and students in neat uniforms walking to and from their classes. "This is it," Gray said as he parked the car and turned to face his children. "You're going to do great here. Remember, you're Montgomerys. You belong here." Grace and Sam exchanged nervous glances, neither feeling the confidence their father was trying to instill in them. As they entered the grand reception hall, they were greeted by the headmistress, Mrs. Thornton. She was an imposing woman with sharp features and an air of authority. Her eyes quickly assessed the children before offering a brief smile. "Welcome to Wellington," Mrs. Thornton said in a clipped tone. "You must be Grace and Sam. We've been expecting you." Grace swallowed hard, while Sam remained glued to his sister's side. The headmistress led them through the school, pointing out various buildings, the library, the science wing, the sports fields, but her words faded into the background as the siblings took in their new reality. This place was a world away from the warmth and familiarity of home. Finally, they reached the dormitories. The girls' and boys' dorms were separate, which meant that Grace and Sam would be living apart for the first time in their lives. The realization hit them both hard, but neither said a word as they were shown to their respective rooms. Grace's dorm was a long corridor of identical rooms, each occupied by 2 students. Her roommate, Lillian, was already unpacking when she arrived. Lillian was tall, with sleek brown hair and a piercing gaze that immediately made Grace feel uncomfortable. "Hi, I'm Grace," she said, trying to be polite. Lillian glanced up briefly before returning to her unpacking. "Lillian," she said curtly. Grace's heart sank. She had hoped for a friend, someone to help her adjust to this new place, but it was clear that Lillian wasn't interested in conversation. Meanwhile, Sam was led to the boys' dorm, where he met his roommate, Ethan. Ethan was a year older, with a cocky grin and an air of superiority that made Sam instantly nervous. "Don't touch my stuff," Ethan said as soon as Sam entered the room. Sam nodded, feeling small and out of place. He had always been shy, and being in a strange place with unfamiliar faces only made it worse. That night, as Grace and Sam lay in their separate beds, they both felt the same overwhelming sense of loneliness. The sounds of the boarding school, the distant chatter of other students, the creaking of the old building only served to remind them how far away they were from home. Grace stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had promised Sam that they would stick together, but now she wasn't sure how they would manage that. Already, she could feel the weight of the expectations placed on them, the pressure to fit in, to succeed, to prove that they belonged at Wellington. As the days turned into weeks, Grace and Sam tried their best to adjust to life at the boarding school. But despite their efforts, they quickly realized that they were outsiders. The other students came from old money, families with generations of wealth and influence, and they treated the Montgomery siblings with thinly veiled disdain. Grace, with her quiet determination, was often ignored, while Sam became an easy target for bullying. The school's prestigious reputation masked the darker reality that Grace and Sam would soon come to know: the isolation, the cruelty, and the pressure that would test their bond as siblings in ways they could never have imagined. Grace Montgomery woke up to the sound of the shrill bell that rang through the corridors of Wellington boarding school. It was only her second day, but already, the weight of her new reality pressed heavily on her chest. The unfamiliar sounds, the sterile smell of the dorm, and the coldness of the atmosphere gnawed at her. She glanced across the room at her roommate, Lillian, who was already up and brushing her long brown hair in front of the mirror. "Breakfast is in 20 minutes, Lillian said flatly, not bothering to look at Grace. Grace nodded, though she knew Lillian couldn't see her. She quickly got out of bed, feeling the icy chill of the tiled floor beneath her feet. Her mind drifted to Sam, wondering how he was coping. The separation from her brother weighed on her more than anything. Sam had always been shy, and Grace knew that being apart from him was like cutting away a part of herself. She hoped, silently, that he was adjusting better than she was. She dressed quickly in her Wellington uniform, neatly pressed grey pants, a white blouse, and a navy blazer with the school crest embroidered on the pocket. The uniform was designed to make everyone look the same, but Grace already felt like she stuck out. Her hair, her accent, her background, everything about her was scrutinized here, even if no one said it out loud. As she walked to the dining hall, she spotted Sam in the distance, standing awkwardly near the entrance, clutching his school bag like a shield. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for her, and the moment they made eye contact, she felt a rush of relief. She hurried over to him, weaving through the sea of students, some of whom barely acknowledged her presence. "Hey, how was your night?" Grace asked, trying to sound cheerful. Sam shrugged, his eyes darting around nervously. "Fine, I guess." Grace noticed the slight tremor in his voice, but she didn't push him. Sam had always been quiet, but she could tell he was struggling more than he let on. They entered the dining hall together, and as they approached the long tables, Grace felt the eyes of their classmates on them. Most of the students sat in cliques, already forming their tight-knit groups. Grace had hoped that being new might earn them some sympathy, but the whispers and glances told a different story. At the far end of the table, a group of older boys were laughing loudly. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered boy with blonde hair, nudged his friend and pointed at Sam. "Hey, new kid," the boy shouted, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's your name again?" Sam froze, his face paling. Grace stepped forward, instinctively placing herself between her brother and the group of boys. "His name is Sam," she said, her voice steady despite the anger boiling inside her. The blonde boy smirked, clearly amused by Grace's defiance. "Oh, so you're the little sister. Cute." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Just so you know, this isn't your daddy's fancy estate. You don't get to act like you own the place here." The comment stung, but Grace refused to let it show. She grabbed Sam's hand and pulled him towards an empty spot at the far end of the table. They sat in silence, the echo of laughter following them. As they ate, Grace could feel Sam trembling beside her. His hands shook as he lifted his fork, and he barely touched his food. "It's just the first day," Grace whispered, trying to comfort him. "It'll get better." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. Over the next few days, it became painfully clear that life at Wellington was not going to be the experience their parents had promised. The school's reputation for excellence masked a darker reality, one where the social hierarchy was rigidly enforced by both students and staff. Grace and Sam, despite their family's wealth, were outsiders, and it didn't take long for them to feel the full force of that exclusion. In class, Grace found herself sitting in the back, often ignored by both the teachers and her peers. The curriculum was challenging, but it wasn't the academics that troubled her, it was the isolation. No one spoke to her unless it was necessary, and when they did, it was with a cold formality that made her feel like she didn't belong. One afternoon, during history class, Grace raised her hand to ask a question. The teacher, Mr. Bartlett, was a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp, angular features. He had a reputation for being strict but fair, though Grace was beginning to doubt the fairness part. "Yes, Grace," Mr. Bartlett said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her. "I was just wondering about the significance of the Anglo-Zulu War in shaping modern South African society," Grace asked, trying to sound confident. There was a pause, and for a moment, Grace thought she had asked a good question. But then Mr. Bartlett's lips curled into a thin, condescending smile. "Ah, the Montgomery girl wants to enlighten us," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Perhaps your father's money has bought you some knowledge that the rest of us aren't privy to." The class erupted into laughter, and Grace felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She lowered her hand, wishing she could disappear into her seat. Mr. Bartlett didn't bother to answer her question, instead moving on as if she had never spoken. Later that day, Grace found Sam sitting alone on the steps outside the main building, his head bowed. She sat down next to him, her heart heavy with worry. "How was your day?" she asked softly. Sam didn't answer at first. He stared at the ground, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "I hate it here," he whispered. Grace's heart ached. She had been trying so hard to keep up appearances, to be strong for Sam's sake, but she knew exactly how he felt. The pressure, the loneliness, the cruelty, it was overwhelming. "Me too," she admitted quietly. "But we have to stick together, okay? We'll get through this." Sam nodded, but his expression remained bleak. The bullying escalated over the weeks. Ethan, Sam's roommate, took every opportunity to make his life miserable. He mocked Sam's quiet demeanor, made fun of his clothes, and spread rumors about him to the other boys. Grace, too, was not spared from the cruelty of her peers. Lillian, her roommate, often made snide remarks about her family's wealth, accusing Grace of being spoiled and entitled. It didn't matter that Grace had done nothing to provoke them, their minds were made up from the moment they had arrived. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Grace sat on her bed, staring out of the small window that overlooked the school's expansive grounds. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. She could hear Lillian and some other girls laughing in the hallway, their voices sharp and mocking. Grace pulled her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them, trying to block out the noise. She missed home. She missed the safety and warmth of her old life, where she didn't have to constantly fight to prove herself. There was a soft knock on her door, and for a moment, Grace's heart lifted. Maybe it was Sam. Maybe he needed her as much as she needed him right now. But when she opened the door, she found Mr. Bartlett standing there, his expression unreadable. "Grace," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "Can I have a word?" Grace hesitated but nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Mr. Bartlett sat on the edge of Lillian's bed, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the photos Grace had pinned to the wall, pictures of her family, of her and Sam laughing together before everything had changed. "You've been struggling," he said after a moment, his tone softer than she had ever heard. Grace blinked, unsure of what to say. It wasn't a question, but she knew he was waiting for a response. "I'm fine," she lied, though her voice betrayed her. Mr. Bartlett sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I know Wellington can be difficult for newcomers. It's a place that demands resilience, and not everyone can handle the pressure." Grace felt a surge of anger rise within her. The pressure. It wasn't the pressure that was breaking her and Sam, it was the cruelty, the isolation, the constant feeling of being an outsider. "I'm trying my best," she said quietly, her voice wavering. Mr. Bartlett stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the darkening sky. "Sometimes, trying isn't enough," he said, almost to himself. There was something about his words that chilled Grace. She wasn't sure what he meant, but the underlying message was clear: if she didn't toughen up, she wouldn't make it here. As the days turned into weeks, Grace and Sam's bond grew stronger. They clung to each other, finding solace in their shared misery. But no matter how much they tried to support each other, the walls of Wellington continued to close in on them. Grace often wondered if their parents had any idea of what they were going through. The weekly calls with Gray and Natasha were brief and surface level. Gray would ask about their grades, Natasha would remind them to make new friends, and then the call would end. Sam Montgomery sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall in front of him. The once pristine white walls of his dormitory room had begun to feel like the bars of a prison cell. It had been months since he and Grace had arrived at Wellington boarding school, but the sense of dread that had consumed him on the first day had only grown stronger. Every day felt like a new challenge. The boys in his dorm, particularly Ethan, had made it their mission to torment him at every opportunity. Ethan's sharp words and cruel jokes echoed in Sam's mind long after the laughter died down. Even in the silence of the night, when the other boys were fast asleep, Sam could hear their mocking voices. At first, he had tried to brush it off, to convince himself that things would get better. But as the weeks turned into months, the cruelty only intensified. He became the target of endless pranks, his books were torn, his shoes thrown into the pool, and once, they even locked him in the janitor's closet for hours. The teachers, including Mr. Bartlett, who had always seemed indifferent, turned a blind eye to the bullying. It was as if the walls of Wellington had ears but no voice to speak up for him. Sam had always been sensitive, more so than Grace. While his sister had managed to keep her head down and focus on her studies, Sam found himself crumbling under the pressure. The weight of the isolation, the bullying, and the constant feeling of being an outsider bore down on him like a suffocating blanket. Grace tried her best to shield him from the worst of it, but even she couldn't protect him from the cruelty that came from all sides. One afternoon, after yet another day of being tormented by his peers, Sam found himself sitting alone on a bench outside the library. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the school grounds, but the beauty of the scene was lost on him. His chest felt tight, and there was a lump in his throat that wouldn't go away. Grace appeared beside him, her face etched with concern. She had noticed how withdrawn he had become, how he rarely spoke anymore. His once lively eyes now seemed dull, and his shoulders sagged as though he carried the weight of the world. "Sam," she said softly, sitting down next to him. "What's going on?" He didn't respond at first, simply staring ahead at the rows of students walking by, oblivious to his pain. "Talk to me," Grace urged, her voice filled with worry. "I know it's hard here, but we've got each other, right?" Sam shook his head, his voice barely audible. "It's not enough." Grace felt her heart clench at his words. She had always prided herself on being strong for him, but now she realized that her strength might not be enough to save him from the torment he was enduring. "They hate me," Sam continued, his voice cracking. "I don't belong here, Grace. I never have." Grace wrapped her arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. She could feel the tremor in his body, the silent struggle he had been fighting for so long. "We'll get through this," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Sam. He moved through his days in a fog, barely able to focus on his classes or his homework. His grades, once decent, began to slip, and his teacher's disappointment only added to the pressure he was already under. Grace did her best to help him with his assignments, but there was only so much she could do. At night, when the dorm was quiet and the other boys were asleep, Sam lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. The darkness felt like a living thing, pressing in on him, suffocating him. He had always been afraid of the dark as a child, but now, it wasn't the darkness itself that scared him, it was the thoughts that came with it. He thought about the boys who bullied him, about the teachers who ignored him, and about the school that seemed to have swallowed him whole. But most of all, he thought about how easy it would be to make it all stop. The idea crept into his mind like a whisper, growing louder with each passing day. Sam couldn't take it anymore. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of bullying, he found himself standing in front of the phone in the common area, his hands trembling as he dialed his home number. He hadn't spoken to his parents in weeks, and he wasn't sure if they would even pick up. Gray and Natasha were always busy with work, their lives consumed by business meetings, charity galas, and social events. But to his surprise, the phone rang only twice before Natasha answered. "Hello," her familiar voice came through the line, warm and distant. Sam's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He wanted to tell her everything, the bullying, the isolation, the constant feeling of being worthless, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, he stood there, gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Sam." Natasha's voice softened. "Is that you?" "Yes," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sweetheart, how are you? We've been meaning to call, but things have been so busy. You know how it is." Sam swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had hoped for comfort, for some sign that his parents would understand what he was going through. But as Natasha continued to talk about her busy schedule, the hope inside him began to wither. "We are so proud of you and Grace," Natasha went on. "Wellington is such a great opportunity. I know it's hard right now, but it's going to make you stronger in the end. This is just a phase of growth." A phase of growth. The words echoed in Sam's mind like a cruel joke. He wanted to scream, to tell her that it wasn't just a phase, that he was drowning in a sea of torment and no one was coming to save him. But instead, he nodded silently, though she couldn't see him. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice hollow. "I guess." "Good," Natasha replied, her voice filled with satisfaction. "I knew you'd understand. We'll come visit soon, okay? Just hang in there, Sam. We love you." The call ended, and Sam stood there, staring at the phone in his hand. He had reached out for help, but all he had gotten in return was empty words and promises that meant nothing. As he walked back to his dorm, the weight of his despair pressed down on him harder than ever. His cry for help had gone unheard, and now, he was truly alone. The night was unusually quiet at Wellington boarding school. The usual chatter and laughter that filled the dormitories had faded into the background, leaving only the sound of the wind howling through the trees outside. Sam lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. His mind was racing, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess that he couldn't control. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, the weight of his despair pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. He thought about the call with his mother, about how she had brushed off his pain as if it were nothing more than a passing phase. He thought about the boys who bullied him, about the teachers who ignored him, and about Grace, his sister who had tried so hard to protect him but couldn't save him from the darkness that had consumed him. As the night wore on, Sam's thoughts grew darker and more desperate. He had tried to be strong, to endure the cruelty and the isolation, but he couldn't do it anymore. The pain was too much, the weight of it unbearable. He glanced over at the small desk in the corner of his room, where a half-written letter sat. It was a letter to Grace, one that he had started but never finished. He wanted to tell her how much he loved her, how grateful he was for everything she had done for him. But now, as he stared at the unfinished letter, he knew he wouldn't be able to find the right words. Instead, he slipped out of bed, his movements slow and deliberate. The dormitory was silent, the other boys fast asleep, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He walked quietly down the hall, his footsteps barely making a sound on the cold, tiled floor. When he reached the stairwell, he paused for a moment, looking down at the steps that led to the rooftop. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. But then, the darkness closed in around him, and he knew there was no turning back. The news of Sam Montgomery's death arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over the Montgomery household. It was the kind of phone call no parent ever wanted to receive, a devastating announcement that sent shockwaves through the hearts of Gray and Natasha. The words from the headmistress of Wellington boarding school were cold and clinical, offering little comfort in their grief. Gray had been in his office, going through his morning briefing with his assistant, when his cell phone rang. At first, he didn't even glance at the caller ID, assuming it was another business contact or perhaps Natasha. But when he answered and heard Mrs. Thornton's grave voice on the other end, a sinking feeling took hold in his stomach. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm afraid I have some tragic news," Mrs. Thornton began, her tone devoid of warmth. Gray felt his heart skip a beat. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. "I'm so sorry to tell you this, but your son, Sam, was found last night. He took his own life." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. For a moment, Gray couldn't comprehend what he had just heard. The words didn't make sense. Sam, his sweet, quiet son, was gone. How could that be? His hands trembled as he dropped the phone, and his assistant rushed forward, her face full of concern. "Mr. Montgomery? Are you all right?" But Gray couldn't respond. His chest tightened as he stood frozen in disbelief. His mind raced with images of Sam, his bright eyes, his shy smile, the way he used to laugh when Grace told him silly jokes. And now, in the blink of an eye, all of that was gone. Natasha was at home when the call came, sitting in the garden with her morning coffee. She had been enjoying the early morning quiet, the birds singing in the distance, when her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She answered without hesitation, expecting nothing more than an update from Gray or a reminder about one of their social engagements. Instead, she was met with Mrs. Thornton's somber voice delivering the news that would change her life forever. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm deeply sorry to inform you that your son, Sam, has passed away. He took his own life last night." Natasha felt the cup slip from her fingers, shattering as it hit the stone patio. The sound was distant, muffled, as if it were happening in another world. The words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't make sense of them. "Sam. Gone." Her heart pounded in her chest as she gasped for air, her vision blurring with tears. How could this be happening? How had they missed the signs? The drive to Wellington boarding school was a blur for both Gray and Natasha. They rode in silence, their grief too raw to be spoken aloud. The weight of what had happened hung between them, thick and suffocating, like a cloud of smoke they couldn't escape. When they arrived at the school, Mrs. Thornton met them at the entrance. Her face was a mask of sympathy, but it did nothing to ease the pain that ripped through the Montgomerys. The headmistress explained the circumstances of Sam's death in a detached, professional manner, as though she were discussing a student's poor grades rather than the loss of a life. "We found him on the rooftop late last night," Mrs. Thornton said quietly. "It appears that he had been struggling for some time, but unfortunately, no one realized how severe it had become." Natasha clutched her husband's arm, tears streaming down her face. "How could you not have known?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger and grief. "How could none of you have seen what was happening to our son?" Mrs. Thornton's expression remained composed. "We do our best to monitor the well-being of all our students, Mrs. Montgomery. But sometimes, these things are hidden, even from those closest to them." The words felt hollow, and Natasha's anger flared. "Hidden," she repeated, her voice rising. "Sam was suffering, and no one did anything." Gray, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice low and heavy. "We trusted the school to take care of our children," he said, his tone laced with bitterness. "We sent them here thinking they would be safe, thinking they would thrive. But instead, our son is dead." Mrs. Thornton lowered her eyes. "I understand your pain, Mr. Montgomery, and I am truly sorry for your loss. If there's anything we can do—" But Gray cut her off, his voice cold and sharp. "You've done enough." The days following Sam's death were a whirlwind of grief, confusion, and guilt. The Montgomery family was thrust into a storm of mourning, with friends and family offering their condolences, though none of it seemed to touch the deep well of pain that had taken root in their hearts. Grace, in particular, was devastated. She had been Sam's protector, his constant companion, and now she was left with the unbearable weight of his loss. She replayed their last conversations over and over in her mind, searching for any signs she might have missed, any clues that could have warned her of what was to come. She remembered the way Sam had withdrawn in recent weeks, how quiet he had become, how he had stopped smiling. At the time, she had assumed it was just the pressure of school, the same pressure they had both been feeling. But now she realized that it had been something far deeper, something darker. And she hadn't been able to save him. In the days that followed, Grace shut herself off from the world, retreating into the safety of her room. She barely spoke to her parents, unable to face the crushing reality of what had happened. Her mind was filled with guilt, with the overwhelming belief that she had failed Sam in the most important way. Natasha and Gray, too, were consumed by their own grief, though they dealt with it in different ways. Natasha threw herself into planning the funeral, trying to keep busy, as if the constant activity could somehow numb the pain. Gray, on the other hand, became distant, withdrawing into himself and avoiding any conversation that reminded him of their loss. He spent hours in his study, staring blankly at the framed photos of Sam and Grace that lined his desk. For the first time in their marriage, Gray and Natasha felt a chasm opening between them. They had always been a strong couple, united by their shared ambitions and love for their children. But now, the weight of their grief seemed too heavy for either of them to bear, and instead of leaning on each other, they drifted further apart. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by close family, friends, and a few teachers from Wellington boarding school. The Montgomery social circle, ever the picture of respectability, came to pay their respects, offering harsh condolences and murmured sympathies. But for Gray and Natasha, the well-meaning words felt like a cruel mockery of the pain they were enduring. As the service came to an end, and the mourners slowly made their way to the reception, Gray stood by Sam's grave, staring down at the simple headstone that bore his son's name. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden glow over the cemetery, but Gray felt no warmth in its light. Natasha stood beside him, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. She reached out and took his hand, her grip tight and desperate, as if she were afraid of losing him too. "We should have seen it," Natasha whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "We should have known." Gray didn't respond for a long time. He had been wrestling with the same thoughts for days, the same crushing guilt that threatened to consume him. He had been so focused on their careers, on giving their children the best life possible, that he had failed to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. "We thought we were doing the right thing," Gray finally said, his voice hollow. "We thought Wellington would give them everything they needed." "But it didn't," Natasha replied, her voice breaking. "It took everything from us." Gray closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. They had sent their children to Wellington believing it would secure their future, but instead, it had torn their family apart. As they stood together in the fading light, the realization settled over them like a heavy shroud. They had lost more than just their son, they had lost the very foundation of their family. And now, all that was left was the painful task of trying to pick up the pieces. In the weeks and months that followed, Gray and Natasha struggled to come to terms with their grief. They attended therapy, both individually and as a couple, but the process of healing was slow and painful. There were days when it felt like the weight of their loss would never lift, when the memories of Sam were too painful to bear. Grace, too, was grappling with her own guilt and grief. She had returned to school, but her heart wasn't in it. The once vibrant, determined girl was now a shadow of her former self, burdened by the knowledge that she hadn't been able to save her brother. It wasn't until months later, after countless therapy sessions and difficult conversations, that the Montgomery family began to slowly heal. The scars of their loss would never fully fade, but in time, they learned to live with the pain, to carry Sam's memory with them as they rebuilt their lives.